The studio lights burned like stage flames, illuminating every corner of the glossy set of America Talks, one of the most watched political talk shows in the nation. There was an electric anticipation in the air, thick with expectation and veiled hostility. J.D. Vance, now the newly sworn-in Vice President of the United States, stepped onto the stage with the calm demeanor of a man who had fought too many battles to flinch in front of a camera. He was composed, his navy suit crisp, his posture straight, and his face unreadable. This wasn't just another interview. Everyone in the room knew it. And so did Marcus Bennett. Bennett, the show's host, was a media veteran with a sharp tongue and a taste for political blood. His lean frame leaned slightly forward in his seat like a hawk sizing up its prey. Publicly, this segment was supposed to be about the new administration's goals. Privately, Marcus had been preparing for this moment for weeks, an ambush veiled in smiles. The pleasantries at the beginning were swift, almost robotic. No one meant them. "Mr. Vice President," Bennett began, eyes glinting with challenge beneath perfectly coiffed hair, "let's talk about your fascinating journey. You once called Donald Trump a cultural heroine. Now you're his second in command. Care to explain the transformation?" Vance didn't blink. "You know, Marcus," he said calmly, "that's actually a great place to start. Because my journey speaks to something bigger than politics. It speaks to the American tradition of growth, of learning, of changing your mind when the facts change." The audience was still surprised by the lack of defensiveness in his tone. His words weren't rehearsed. They were lived. Bennett cocked his head, clearly not expecting such poise. "Growth and understanding," he repeated, his voice coated in mockery. "Is that what we're calling political convenience these days?" Vance's smile didn't waver. "In America, we honor the tradition of open minds. When I criticized President Trump, I hadn't yet seen the results of his policies, how they lifted up the forgotten men and women I wrote about. But I did see it, and I changed." Bennett's smirk faltered for just a moment. "And tell me, Marcus," Vance continued, his tone casual yet disarming, "have you ever changed your mind about something important?" A beat passed, too long for live television. "We're here to talk about you, Mr. Vice President," Bennett snapped, shifting his weight, cards in hand. "Let's move on to your recent remarks at the National Prayer Breakfast. You spoke of divine guidance in government. Don't you think that's a dangerous mix of church and state?" The tension tightened like a coiled spring. "Divine guidance?" Vance echoed, leaning in slightly. "What I said was that moral clarity is vital for leadership. Our founding fathers weren't afraid of faith, they were afraid of tyranny. And they knew that freedom doesn't come from government, it comes from God." A ripple of amens and nods moved through the studio. "But in a diverse country," Bennett began. "Let me finish this thought," Vance interjected gently but firmly. "I took my oath on a Bible, the same as countless leaders before me, not to impose religion, but to honor where our rights truly come from." From the shadows, Bennett's producer glanced nervously at a cue monitor. The audience wasn't reacting the way they'd expected. "And you know," Vance added with a faint smile, "no one ever questioned the chaplains who prayed with us before missions in the Marines. Even the skeptics understood that in those moments, faith wasn't divisive. It was grounding." Bennett clenched his jaw. He pivoted. "Let's talk about your relationship with President Trump. You recently said he might be God's instrument for America's renewal. That's quite the leap for a Yale-educated lawyer." Vance's reply was quiet but resolute. "What's extreme, Marcus, is how the media obsesses over a man who prays while ignoring policies that help working-class families. But since you brought up results, let's talk about them. Not sound bites. Real change." The words landed like thunder. The audience, once skeptical, was leaning in now. Bennett's usual rhythm faltered. His interruptions stalled. The battle he'd prepared for was slipping through his fingers. He tried again. "Mr. Vice President," he said sharply, "you talk about character, but you've reversed every major opinion you once held. Isn't that just ambition dressed up as principle?" "That's interesting," Vance replied, his voice still calm. "Because where I come from, we judge a man not by how well he fits into the Washington elite, but by whether he owns up to his mistakes." The crowd stirred. Bennett blinked. "Yes, I criticized Trump. And yes, I changed my mind. That's what integrity looks like, not sticking to a mistake just to save face." The studio air had thickened into something molten, intense, volatile, and charged with energy. J.D. Vance sat still, like a statue carved from steel. Marcus Bennett, however, was shifting in his seat now, ever so slightly. The crowd's subtle reactions had become louder, audible, and to a seasoned host, that shift in tide was a crack in the dam. He glanced at his producer again. She mouthed something he couldn't make out. Whatever it was, it didn't matter now. Time to go for the jugular. "Vice President Vance," Bennett said, clearing his throat, "you've spoken a lot about working-class America. Faith. Integrity. But let's discuss your most controversial statement yet. You said, and I quote, 'America doesn't need more experts. It needs more fathers.' Isn't that a dog whistle? A coded message to the far right?" A low murmur stirred in the audience. There it was, the hit. But Vance didn't even blink. "I said that because it's true," he replied, voice low and steady. "We've built a culture that elevates credentials over character, career over commitment, and it's breaking our communities." Bennett's eyes narrowed. "So you're blaming America's problems on fatherlessness?" "I'm pointing to a crisis of responsibility. You don't have to be a sociologist to see it," Vance shot back. "Go to Dayton, go to Youngstown. You'll find kids with no guidance, mothers working double shifts, and neighborhoods hollowed out by men who walked away. That's not ideology, that's reality." The words were raw, too real, too direct. And suddenly, it wasn't just policy being debated, it was culture, identity, the moral foundation of the nation. Bennett tried to pivot again, grasping for safer ground. "But surely you see how such rhetoric can be exclusionary. It implies a singular path to virtue. What about families who don't fit your mold?" Vance's eyes sharpened. "You're missing the point, Marcus. This isn't about attacking different families. It's about restoring a cultural ideal we've abandoned, not because it's convenient, but because it works." There was steel in his voice now. "I didn't grow up with a father around. I know what that does to a child. And I also know what it means when a man decides to show up, even after years of absence. Redemption is real, but we have to name the problem before we fix it." The audience was silent, but attentive. Some nodded, some didn't, but they were all listening. Bennett leaned back, masking frustration with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Fine," he said flatly. "Let's shift to another theme you love to discuss. The so-called elites. You've made a career out of punching up. Yale Law, venture capital, a Senate seat, and now the vice presidency. Isn't it just a little hypocritical?" J.D. smiled, almost softly this time. "It's not hypocrisy to rise and still speak for the place you came from. It's called loyalty." He paused. "You ever walk through a town where half the storefronts are shuttered and the only new building is a methadone clinic? That's my America. That's who I fight for." The crowd let out a low, collective sound, neither applause nor protest, just recognition. "And the so-called elites you mention," Vance continued, "they've failed that America. Not because they're smart, but because they're arrogant. They think values are optional. They think patriotism is outdated, and they think faith is something to mock on cable news." That line hit like a gut punch. Bennett straightened. "Are you suggesting this network mocks faith?" Vance turned to the camera, not the host. "I'm suggesting that millions of Americans feel like strangers in their own country. Like their beliefs are punchlines, and they're tired of being polite about it." The studio went dead silent. A pause stretched so long that the control room considered cutting to commercial, but they didn't. Then Bennett struck again, but this time not with a question, with a name. Your wife, Usha, a successful lawyer, Indian-American, liberal by all accounts. How does she square with your vision? Or is she just an accessory to your rebranding? Gasps. Real ones. Even the cameraman flinched, but J.D. didn't rise, didn't lash out. Instead, he leaned forward, slowly. His jaw clenched, but his words were measured. You want to drag my wife into this? Fine. Here's what you need to know. A pause. She's brilliant. She's kind. She's a mother who sacrifices daily, and she challenges me like no one else ever has. Another pause. And if you think I married her to score political points, you don't know a damn thing about love. Or about me. Bennett looked stunned. For the first time all evening, he had no retort. Vance sat back, eyes never leaving his. And for the record, he added, she believes in this country just as fiercely as I do. That's why we're raising our kids here. That's why we stay, not because it's perfect, but because it's ours. The tension in the room had reached a boiling point. There was no going back now. The studio lights felt unbearably hot, as if they were pressing in on Vance and Bennett both, forcing them to either fold or double down. J.D. Vance had dug in, and now the audience was fully invested. It was no longer just a political debate. It was personal. Bennett, caught off guard, quickly tried to regain control of the narrative. His sharp tone returned, but there was something different in his eyes now. A flicker of hesitation. Well, let's shift back to something more grounded in reality, Vice President Vance, Bennett said, clearing his throat. You claim to represent the working class, but let's talk about policy. You've supported tax cuts for the wealthiest Americans. How does that fit into your narrative of protecting working families? Vance didn't miss a beat. His gaze remained steady, unflinching. It's about freedom, Marcus. When you give people more of their own money, they can decide how to use it. They can invest in their families, their communities. That's not trickle-down economics. That's freedom in action. The audience's reactions were mixed. Some murmured in approval, while others scoffed. Bennett raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. Freedom, huh? He said, leaning forward, eyes narrowing. But the people you're defending, the working class, they don't see it that way. They're not seeing that freedom. They're seeing corporations getting richer while their wages stagnate. They're seeing their healthcare premiums go up, their jobs disappearing, so how exactly does more freedom help them? Vance's response was calm, but there was a fire in his voice. He'd expected this attack. It's easy to point to the system and blame it. It's harder to look at the culture that surrounds us, he began, leaning slightly forward. You can throw all the money in the world at a broken system, but if you don't fix the underlying issues, the broken families, the erosion of moral values, then you're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound. Bennett scoffed. And who gets to decide what's broken, J.D.? You? People like you? Vance shot back, his voice hardening. You think a bunch of career politicians are the answer? You think more government is going to fix people's lives? That's the illusion you've been selling. The studio audience was in full attention now. It wasn't just the words anymore. It was the raw intensity of the exchange. J.D. wasn't just arguing for policy. He was laying bare his worldview. Look around, Marcus, Vance continued, his tone rising slightly. The more you give the government, the less people have to fight for themselves. What we need isn't more handouts. It's more pride, more work ethic, more responsibility. Bennett, not one to be easily outmaneuvered, tried again. And what about the workers, J.D.? The ones who can't make ends meet because wages aren't keeping up? What do you tell them? Pull yourself up by your bootstraps? For the first time in the debate, J.D. allowed a faint smile to cross his face, a knowing smile. No, Marcus. I tell them that America is still the land of opportunity, that if they have the will to work, they can make something of themselves. I know it's not easy, but it's worth it." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "But I'll also tell you this. For too long, we've allowed people to be victims. We've allowed them to believe that the world owes them something. It doesn't. The truth is, no one is going to fix your problems except you." Bennett shot him a glare, but there was something in his eyes now, a crack, a tiny admission that Vance's words were stinging. He glanced at the audience, the ever-watchful camera crew, and realized this wasn't the usual easy back and forth he was used to. He was losing ground. "Let's move on then," Bennett said quickly, the shift in his voice clear. He turned to the next topic. "You've been critical of the tech industry, Silicon Valley, big companies. But aren't they creating jobs? Aren't they the ones driving innovation? Do you really think we can compete globally without them?" Vance's answer was measured, but sharp. "Silicon Valley is driving innovation, yes, but at what cost? You can't have one sector growing at the expense of the rest of the country. That's the issue. These tech giants are enriching themselves and outsourcing American jobs overseas. They're creating wealth, but not for the people who need it most. It's the equivalent of building castles in the sky while the ground crumbles beneath our feet." Bennett opened his mouth to counter, but Vance wasn't finished. "I'll tell you this," Vance continued. "We need tech, we need innovation, but we also need to make sure that the wealth being generated is spread out. We need to make sure that working Americans aren't left in the dust while billionaires get richer." The debate was heating up now. The audience had started leaning forward, hanging on every word, feeling the crackling tension between the two men. Bennett's next move was key. "Let's talk about the future then, Vice President," Bennett said, a forced calm in his voice. "If you're not going to fix things with handouts or government intervention, what's your vision for America in the next 10 years? Is it just more of the same? More culture wars and rhetoric?" Vance's eyes narrowed, the gleam in them sharper than before. "Number, it's a return to the basics. A return to common sense, a country that values hard work, a country that values families, a country that values the things that made us great in the first place." The words hit hard. "And we'll get there," Vance added, voice steady, unwavering, "by making sure every single American has the chance to rise, not by handing them the keys to a system that's already broken, but by giving them the tools to rebuild it." There was no applause this time, just the weight of his statement hanging in the air. The next question was already forming in Bennett's mind, but he could feel it now. The ground beneath him was shifting, and the debate wasn't just about politics anymore. It was a battle of wills, of ideals, and they both knew it was far from over. The room was electric, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. The audience was no longer just passive observers. They were part of the battle. The way the lights gleamed off J.D. Vance's face, the set of his jaw, and the intensity in his eyes told a story of determination, a man who had been through the fire and come out unscathed. Across from him, Marcus Bennett's face had tightened. His usual confidence was cracking. This wasn't the easy debate he had prepared for. This was the final round of a fight that neither side was willing to lose. Bennett shifted in his seat, his expression a mixture of frustration and resolve. He had been pushed to his limits, but he still wasn't ready to admit defeat. He took a deep breath and leaned forward, his voice cool but with an edge of desperation. "Vice President Vance," he began, "you talk a big game about values and hard work. But what happens when those values are tested? What happens when they collide with the very system that you say is broken?" Vance didn't flinch. His voice was calm, collected, everything Bennett was not. "They're not tested in the way you think," Vance replied evenly. "It's not about passing laws or enacting policies. It's about the character of a nation. When people hold themselves accountable, when they live by the values that have always made America great, the system can't break. It might bend, but it won't break." Bennett's lip curled into a sneer. And how exactly do you plan to ensure that character is preserved when the country is so divided, when everyone seems to have their own version of what's right? It's a fantasy, J.D. You can't just wish for unity. J.D. met his gaze, unblinking. No, you're right. It's not easy, but it's necessary. We've spent too long chasing fleeting comforts, making excuses. Real strength comes from the tough times, not the easy ones. We need to stop pretending like we can build a great nation without putting in the work. For a moment, Bennett was silent. The words had struck harder than he expected. His next question came slower, more deliberate, as if he was trying to regain his composure. All right, then. Let's talk about real-world implications, he said, a subtle shift in tone. What happens when your ideals clash with the reality of governance? What happens when those values lead to policies that hurt the very people you claim to care about? Vance didn't hesitate. You can't make everyone happy, Marcus, and you shouldn't try. The goal is not to appease every person or every group. The goal is to build a society that fosters opportunity, where individuals have the freedom to rise, to succeed, or to fail on their own terms. Bennett's voice grew more animated now, the facade of calm slipping. So you're willing to sacrifice the most vulnerable for the sake of this freedom? To ignore the people who are struggling? Vance leaned in, his eyes narrowing with focus. What you call sacrifice is what I call self-reliance. It's about empowering people to stand on their own 2 feet. We don't need more government programs. We need a country that gives people the tools to fight for themselves. But that means having the courage to make tough choices. Bennett's expression twisted in disbelief. And that's your solution? To tell the most vulnerable to stand up when the system is rigged against them? The crowd was silent now, hanging on every word. Bennett had laid out his challenge. The question was, would Vance back down? No, Vance replied firmly. The system isn't perfect, but it can be fixed. And we'll fix it by creating more opportunity, not more dependence. We'll fix it by focusing on what's important. Families, communities, education, and jobs. That's what will pull this country out of the hole it's in. Bennett opened his mouth, ready to fire back, but something in the air had changed. It wasn't just the argument, it was the stakes. The battle had become something more, something bigger than a political debate. This was a war of ideologies, a contest of values that was being played out on live television before a national audience. Marcus, Vance said, his voice cutting through the tension, you want to blame the system. I get that, but blaming isn't the answer. Action is. Leadership is about making decisions that hurt in the short term but create lasting change. That's how we restore what's been lost. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Vance wasn't backing down, and Bennett realized he wasn't going to win this with words alone. The battle wasn't just about policy, it was about vision, and at that moment, it was clear. J.D. Vance had a vision that resonated, a vision that many in the audience could feel deep down. Even Bennett couldn't deny it. But there was no time for reflection. Bennett was ready to make his final strike, pulling out a question he'd been saving for this exact moment. You talk about leadership, J.D., but let's look at the track record, Bennett said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Your party's leadership has led us to the brink of economic disaster. What makes you think you're the right person to lead this country out of the mess you helped create? Vance's eyes flashed, but his composure didn't crack. He leaned forward, his response steady and deliberate. I don't deny there have been mistakes, he said, his voice lower now, filled with gravity. But I'm not here to fight old battles or play the blame game. I'm here to fix things, and I'm not just talking about the economy. I'm talking about restoring faith in our institutions. I'm talking about restoring faith in ourselves. The finality in his voice left little room for further argument. The debate had reached its apex. Bennett knew the game was up. His eyes flicked to the camera, then back to Vance. The exhaustion was visible now, a man who had pushed as hard as he could but realized that his opponent was a different kind of force. Vance had been relentless, but it was more than that. It was a quiet confidence, a belief in the possibility of change that Bennett couldn't shake. For the first time that night, Marcus Bennett stood up, nodding slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement. "You've made your point, J.D.," Bennett said, his voice tight, a forced politeness hanging in his tone. "I'm done here." Vance stood as well, his posture straight and unyielding. "It's not over, Marcus," he said softly, but with power. "It's just beginning." As Bennett left the stage, the cameras caught the look of intensity on J.D. Vance's face, a man who had faced down his critics, held his ground, and emerged victorious in the court of public opinion. The audience erupted into applause, but it was clear this was more than just a political debate. It was a defining moment. For J.D. Vance, it was a victory that went beyond the headlines. It was the beginning of something much larger. And for Marcus Bennett, it was a loss that he would have to reckon with long after the cameras were turned off. The lights dimmed, the set emptied, but the echoes of the debate would linger in the minds of everyone who had watched. And America, once again, was forced to confront the clash of ideals that would shape its future.